We didn't get a radio mic, did we?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have. Yeah, we have. Yeah, that sounds like it's good. 1, 2, 3. Here we go.
Gillian, there's another one.
Oh, we've got lots of radio.
Hello everyone, welcome to the event for Coos, the memorial and celebration. We're very pleased that you're here. Oh, sorry, my name's Valerie. I thought
No.
my name's Valerie Walkerdine, and this is. Oh, I've missed one.
Julian Henriques.
So we organised the event together because we wanted to share with everybody, thank you Julian, elementary mic technique. We wanted to share with everyone the celebration and memory of Coos's life, especially his intellectual life, which was, he gave so much to the world in terms of his writing, and so that's what we're going to talk about, remember, celebrate tonight, and look forward to the next generation who will use his work. So I'm going to say a few words, and then...
Should we say hi to Francesca?
Oh yes. Francesca Ashurst, Coos's wife, is hopefully watching us on the live stream from Devon. So I want to welcome Francesca to the event.
I think we should welcome Scarlett and Rod as well. Scarlett, Coos and Francesca's daughter, her partner. And Harry, the other son, or another of the sons, on his way, I believe.
Yes, and Sam also, Coos's stepson, was trying to be on his way because he's been at the Cannes Film Festival, but his flight was very seriously delayed, so he's not quite sure whether he will make it. But we know he'll be here in spirit.
And can I say, and thank you to, I know there's some students here. I don't think this works, does it?
I don't know, he's been speaking into nothing.
There are some students here, I think. So thank you for coming as well. Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Does it work?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm just going to start off the proceedings with a little bit taken from something I wrote for Coos's funeral, and also a small amount taken from one version of the obituary that I wrote for The Guardian. It took me about 10 iterations to get a version that the Guardian would print. So this also has some of the outtakes. On the 4th of August 1939, the second child of 10 children, a son, was born into the Tamil Venkatasamy family in Mauritius. A family descended from indentured labourers brought from India to work the sugar plantations. Customary calculations were made to plot the astrological coordinates of the birth, and the child was duly named Subramanya, after, I think, one of the Tamil names of the Hindu god of war. Subramanya, who came to be known, as with all members of his family, by his nickname, Coos, is traditionally depicted with a spear. Now, many people have talked about Coos as being a very gentle person. And so it did make me think about what it meant for this very gentle man to be named after a god of war. But actually, Coos wielded his pen very effectively. And it was always in the service of fighting for justice, in support of important struggles throughout his entire life. Not least, the last great struggle that we're going to hear about, that he bequeathed to us, those who remain here, to hear his white war cry, calling to us to fight against the injustices, all injustices, and to save our planet. So, Coues actually grew up in Mauritius, as I said, and his father agreed to send him to university in St Andrews, but only if he would study mathematics. So that duly is what Coues did. Welcome, Harry and Bea. He went there in 1961, where his attention actually quickly turned away from maths and onto philosophy. And he became part of the post-68 generation, where, as you will hear, he was one of a group of us who started a journal called Ideology and Consciousness. And we thought we were very clever at the time. We thought we were going to change the world, actually. But one of the things that Coues did was introduce French thinking and French theory, and that issue with French work and his work on translation never left him. He grew up speaking French, English, and Creole. When he was still a young child, Coues suffered an accident in which he was burnt with boiling water and wasn't expected to live. For some years, he couldn't go to school and developed the habit of shutting himself away to read prodigiously, a habit that never left him. It was on his move to St Andrews that he encountered the racism of naming, in which his Scots fellow students said that they could not pronounce his family name, Benkafsami, but also that his first name must be Coots. They made it into a Scottish name. And having suffered from bullying as a sick child, he agreed to be known at first as Coots, but then later reverted to Coues as I think we should understand as an act of defiance. So it was in that time of the 60s, the cultural moment, that we're going to begin our journey with Coues today. We're going to hear and celebrate all, hopefully, his major work. We're here because we cared for Coues, and we're here because we want to think about that work. So we're presenting it biographically. We're going to start with the journal Ideology and Consciousness, which later became I&C, because we thought ideology and consciousness was a bit passé. And then we're going to go on to Changing the Subject, which was a jointly authored book, and Julian Henriques and Elisa Blackman are going to talk about both those things. Then we are going through talking about his important books. Ashwinder Sharma is going to talk about Occidentalism. Gargi Bhattacharya is going to talk about the post-colonial challenge. Mike Featherston and Ryan Bishop are from Theory, Culture and Society are going to talk about the journal, especially the New Encyclopedia Project. Tiziana Terranova, if we can get her, from Italy. She's having a problem with her microphone on Skype, but we're going to try and get her a different way, is going to talk about the jointly produced special issue of TCS on Foucault. Diane Ray is going to talk about the book Inequality, Poverty, Education that Kuz co-authored with Francesca. Shella Sheikh is going to talk about After Capital, his last book. And also, hopefully, if the technology works, Bracha Ettinger is going to speak on Skype from Paris to talk about the very last work that Kuz was doing right up until days before his death. Kuz was writing a last paper to be published in a special issue of Subjectivity. He never finished the paper, but we have a first part of it and some notes from the second part. And the one thing he wanted was for Bracha to be able to comment on it. So I think she will share those comments with us tonight. It was a paper about neo-fascism, and it was something that Kuz really wanted to give to the future. So I'm going to hand over now to Lisa and Julian.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much, Val. Thank you very much, Val. Yes, and so, okay. So I'm going to say a little bit about how I enjoy working with Kuz from when I first met him, all through these years. Yes, thank you. And our first project together was, it says May 1977, right, which is a long time ago. And it's been a relationship, an intellectual relationship and a friendship that I've shared with Kuz for all those years. And it's been quite an amazing resource to have as a friend someone with his breadth of knowledge and erudition. And I'm talking about the Encyclopedias project and encyclopedic knowledge at the end of the phone. And that I consider that as a major privilege that I've been able to enjoy. And so I'm going to say a few words just about that. And I mean, it's about generations as well, right? Ideology and consciousness, that is 2 generations ago. And, I mean, it's not just one generation, it's 2 generations, maybe 50 years, right? 40 plus years. And so, of course, I was rereading this to find out what we were thinking and what we were saying. And I mean, it's quite staggering. But in one sense, there's the naivety of it, the other sense, the confidence and the ambition of what we were trying to do in those days, right? And it made me think that, well, there's lots of things. It made me think about how, if you're actually doing anything important, you don't actually know that you're doing it at the time. You know what I mean? That you're actually in a moment, you're sharing it with other people, you have a vibe, a zone that you're in, making this work, responding to the environment as we years afterwards. That something was actually really happening there that was interesting and important. And also what I was picking up from reading the contents page and the ambitions of it, our project is to develop an adequate theory of ideology, one sufficiently comprehensive to embrace both social and individual aspects. I mean, that's great stuff, right? That I see that same confidence in, well, basically in my children and their friends and my students, right? That to be able to get to feel that they now can get a grip of the world in some way and to use the ideas that are around to help us handle what's happening to us. And of course the circumstances were very different then. This was before Thatcherism. This is before the 80s. And so what we were trying to do in understand Marx and Freud principally was to basically to develop a critique of psychology in relation to basically a welfare state. Right, think of that. I mean, you guys have not experienced it, and unfortunately may never do so. And so there was a very, very different environment to what we have now, but yet what we were beginning to think through, I would want to maintain, is actually quite relevant to where we are now. And one of the ways that we were doing that, which was very important, was in our practice, in our collective practice. And that meant meeting together, it meant seeing a lot of each other. And in a way we were talking about subjectivity, we were writing about subjectivity, we were thinking about subjectivity, but we were also embodying it in retrospect in a very literal way, that we wrote as a collective subject, right? And we basically, that was our mode of being or mode of becoming. And when I say collective subject, I mean something that is not essentialized, something that is distributed, right? Something that is embodied, right? Very much embodied. And when I think of Coos, I always think of good food, right? He was a bit of an epicure, right? And so our meetings, when we had them, which was really quite often, were always revolved around food and bringing food and sharing food and literally breaking bread together. And that was part of our conviviality, part of our subjectivity as a group, as a collective, right, which was very much part of how we operated. And I think what we did was possible because of that shared ambiance, that shared liberty, as we say in Jamaica, of being together. And of course, in another sense, we could say we were also a nomadic subject because we literally travelled around the country at great speed in Vowels and Triumph, TR, whatever it was.
Vitesse.
Triumph Vitesse, Red Vitesse, which is quite a hairy journey, to be together in different parts of the country, to have collective weekends and to do the writing together. And that was both with changing the subject, the several issues of the magazine that we managed to produce, and later, as we're just going to hear from Lisa, with changing the subject. And so I just want to say a few words to end about some of the things that came out of this magazine, Ideology and Consciousness, thinking about it in retrospect, is about how, well, I think Lisa's going to talk about this, how, in a way you could say, how foundational it was, right, in terms of the critiques of the radical psychology and the post-psychology and the psychosocial studies that we have now, I think owe a lot to the work that Coos and all of us were doing in that period. And I think that's really important. And we had one of the sort of leading if you like, trajectories was in terms of this critique of what we would now call binary oppositions, and binaryism. I mean, what we were hung up on is the individual and society. And this was, and we wanted to find a way, as I just quoted, for a theory of ideology and the consciousness that was not subject to those binaries. And so that opened up, and especially through Coos's work, right, a whole sort of set of ideas around relationality, about reciprocation, about co-creation, co-constitution, mutualities, which are not out of place in current debates about affect and so on. And so that's the second, the 3 points I wanted to make about the currency of the ideas that Coos was helping us to develop. And you've got Lazzaroto saying, for example, today the weakness of capitalism lies in the production of subjectivity. And so the issues that we were raising in those years are still have come back into fashion, I could put it like that. And then the last point I want to make is simply that in Coos's work, right, from also in changing the subject, there is a terrific continuity of interest between those days and these. I find that in my own work as well, that there was a consistency of purpose and a direction to explore these issues. I mean, he was resourced with his knowledge of French and bringing to bear a whole array of continental, as they were called then, thinkers, right? And we're translating Foucault in the magazine Irrigare, Braca Etanger, who we're going to hear from, I think, a little bit later, and others, Volosanov, and putting them into circulation in a way where the establishment was very hostile to continental thinking in the 70s and early 80s. And so just to end on, it's about continuity, and I just to read out the title of this what will be his posthumous publication in the journal Subjectivity, again evidence of the interest in these areas continuing through Lisa's and Val's editorship. Basically, the affective field and political subjectivities in the shadow of neo-fascism. And that is really apposite. I mean, as you just said, Val, of actually what he's bequeathed to us in the thinking and the working that he's been doing, really apposite to where we are now. And just to say that I find so much sympathy in the way Coos was thinking and the way that I'm currently trying to think. He was developing a field theory of affect. Really interesting. So I just, if I may, quote just from this, which will be published shortly in Subjectivity. The affective field is the fifth fundamental force, together with weak gravitational, what is that, weak nuclear force and the strong one. The fifth fundamental force affecting bodies in a specific way. You might explain quantum entanglement as well as empathy. The standpoint of co-constitution and co-vulnerabilities implies an ethics of generosity, of welcoming the other, of responsibility for the other, and ontological indebtedness that can inform a non-self-interested politics. Okay, so those words, which you'll be able to read soon enough, for me, bring together many of Cous's strength as an intellectual, and it's those strengths that from today and from reading his work we can take forward, as every other speaker I'm sure will be saying as we follow on today. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. Hi everybody. I've told this story before, so apologies to those who've heard it, but I'm going to come in via the 1980s, and I was studying psychology at what was then called NELP. People might remember NELP. Then it became PEL, and now it's called UEL. So I was at NELP between 1987 and 1990. I didn't know then that Coos was also at NELP. I was in a different campus. The psychology department was in Stratford. And it was a really interesting time. It was a kind of heady time of critique, certainly at NELP. And so when I was studying psychology, there was a crisis. That's how it was framed. There was a crisis in the discipline. Now, as you were saying, you can only really understand retrospectively what was happening. I can see now that the psychology I studied wouldn't be classified as psychology now, which is, I think, why I left the discipline of psychology like many others did. So at that time there was deemed to be a crisis. There were more black and minority ethnic psychologists joining the discipline. There was the birth of what came to be known as feminist psychology, the rise of critical psychology. So this was all happening in the department I was in. There was also Graham Richards, who was teaching philosophy of science. He published the book Race and Racism in Psychology and putting psychology in its place. So it was a really important time for me going into education as a working class student who got a full grant. Again, I'm sorry to the students here. I had a full grant to claim a housing benefit during the holidays. But changing the subject wasn't on the reading list. And this was despite the kind of criticality and radicality that that I was being presented with and being engaged by. So I actually had a serendipitous encounter with changing the subject in Compendium Books in Camden, which is no longer. So I saw it on the bookshelf, and I thought, wow, changing the subject, psychology, social regulation, subjectivity, I like the look of that. So this is the book, bought circa 1988, I think. And I read it, and I'm not exaggerating to say it literally changed my life. It both confirmed some of the deep-rooted problems I had with psychologization, but it really opened up for me a framework, a project for thinking about subjectivity. It gave me a language, and I went to my tutors and I said, why isn't this book on the reading list? And they hadn't heard of it, and I was appalled. And so I thought, well, right, I'm going to, in the third year, it was then all exams, I'm going to write every essay question through this, which is what I did. I thought, I'll either fail or I ended up with a first. I think they were terrified, perfectly honest. So this book is, I mean, it's falling apart now, but this was so important to me. And actually, Koos's chapter made it possible for me to go on and do a PhD. And I've read and reread this chapter, and I really agree with Julian that you can see this continuity in thinking. And I think that continuity is really important, because often we're chasing the new and the fashionable, the new this and the turn to that. But actually there's a continuity in this work that is astounding, and for me it's that genealogical approach, that looking at the historical specificity of how we frame problems in particular ways, and particularly the place of psychology in the constitution, the perpetuation, the reinforcement of particular social relationships, and particularly understandings that come out of a dualism between the individual and the social. So this was very much displacing the idea of a separation between the individual and society, and critiquing what was called the unitary rational subjective psychology, and to really get the measure of how you might do that. And so the subjective psychology, which is Koos's explicit chapter within the book, talks about the importance of genealogy, of understanding the historical emergence of psychology and the role it's played from its inception in governing and managing populations in relation to a very historically specific conception of what it means to be human. A conception which is based on an unmarked whiteness, maleness, straightness, and which obscured and denigrated class privilege and entitlement. So this really appealed to me. So for me the book was very much a moment of that time, but took the kind of critical project that I was being shaped through just much further into philosophy, into French social theory, into psychoanalysis, particularly Lacanian psychoanalysis, which was, and if any people know who study psychology, you don't study psychoanalysis, that's completely bucketed. So I took these genealogical ideas, and it made me possible to go on and do a PhD actually at Goldsmiths with Nicholas Rose. Now I didn't know then that Nicholas Rose was part of ideology and consciousness. Neither did I ever imagine at that time that Julian, Valerie and Koos particularly would become, I count, some of my closest friends, collaborators, mentors. For Koos particularly, as the focus of this evening is Koos, I know that Valerie would have introduced us. What's my great honour was we had a project, which I hope we still will do, which was changing the subject part 2. I was invited to be part of this. I mean, honestly, I haven't quite got over this yet. So we better do it. And also, so through that, thinking about what changing the subject might look like now, which I think is really what Coos has really developed in After Capital, which we'll hear about, particularly with Jeremy Gilbert's reflections at the end. I then worked with Coos on Body and Society for, I think, 12 years. We edited a special issue of Body and Society together on affect, which was really, again, developing this post-psychological project in the context of the field of affect studies, where I think Coos was really developing things that then come out in After Capital. So I think what I'm really saying, I wanted to just read you the first paragraph of Coos's chapter, because I think it really sets the scene. So Coos says, for more than 100 years now, psychology has not ceased to calibrate the human subject. It's given itself the task of plotting the distribution of human characteristics, of charting people's abnormalities as in speech marks, and pathologies and speech marks. It's drawn up taxonomies of behaviour that seek to set the norms of human conduct. Its findings are inscribed in a multitude of practices in institutions of all kinds. But does psychology have the measure of the subject? And what do all these instruments regulate? I mean, it really is like the beginning of a tour de force. And I think that's really what Coos has given us when we put all of his work together. And it needs to be passed on to future generations. I feel so honoured that I work, that this book literally has become my life in so many ways, and through a friendship with Coos. And I think it's incumbent on us now to take this forward. And I know there is a second-year undergraduate student in here who we teach a module which is really basically based on this changing the subject, post-psychology, and you didn't know I existed and was in the department, and then Valerie rocked up earlier. So, you know, it really, we're keeping this alive, and I think, I hope this is the beginning of to go forward. So, thank you.
Thanks for the invitation to contribute to this. I'm very honoured. I have to apologise. Normally I've got to read, otherwise it'll go on for half an hour. And my printer broke down today, as they normally do. So I'm going to read off the screen, like young people do. So we'll see how that goes. I'm going to speak a little bit about ostentativism, modernity and subjectivity, which Coos wrote, was published in 2000. Mourning is an ongoing conversation with the dead. Mourning is an ongoing conversation with the dead. I met Coos when I started in the Department of Cultural Studies at the University of East London in 1993. And my abiding memory of Coos in those years, probably of many of us, was meeting a passionate and generous thinker who always seemed to be, we always seemed to be in protracted conversations, whether in a teaching context, departmental meeting, seminar, or over a coffee. The conversations moved imperceptibly across numerous interests: the place of the diasporic and exiled thinker, the state of the world, politics, economics, as well as theory. We started to put together a post-colonial course on post-colonial cultures, which in the end he did not teach. I think, although we're not sure, he left UL in 1998, but maybe someone knows better. But the traces of our discussions and plans in the 90s continue to inform my teaching and writing even now. Coups is a sort of spectral presence whose ideas require me to think harder, to see the world in all its complexities. I learned so much from Coups, not just about critical thought, but about the political urgency of criticism in everyday sociality, in the here and now. He embodied the value of intellectual work and how to do it without being egotistical, a rare feat in academia. With Coups, it was always a dialogic, open conversation. He listened as much as he spoke, always open to new ideas and thinking. Even my own half-baked ideas to think the popular and the philosophical, he did listen to. I don't think too much of it on, but yes. I think Coups' writings are a conversation with others, theories and thinkers, but also with himself, an internal conversation. His writings lay bare his working through in meticulous detail the anatomy of his thinking. He brings into critical proximity disparate fields of study to offer us a route through the discursive terrain. As Coups said, referencing Stuart Hall in Occidentalism, the post-colonial as thinking at the limit. The post-colonial is as thinking at the limits, a formulation that exemplifies Coups' work. Occidentalism, published in 2000, brings together into dialogue the then contemporary work on modernity and its crisis of post-modernity with post-colonial theory and studies. His sustained argument in the book is that colonial space was historically and discursively necessary for the establishment of modernity and the modern form of the subject. The unfolding of this argument is one Coups had been working through for many years, perhaps always up till now. He always anticipates the future in the conceptualization of the historical present. Recently, while sorting out my sprawling library, i.e. books on the floor, I refound an essay booklet that Coups had written for then the new ethnicities unit led by Phil Cohen, which was published, the booklet was published in 1993, 7 years before the book. It's called Occidentalism and Its Discontents. Some might remember it. I'm tempted to say, and I have read it again now while I was trying to read the book at the same time, I was tempted to say that even in this earlier extended essay of 93, all the elements, maybe the problematic of Coups' corpus, as developed from changing the subject to Occidentalism published to follow, were already in play. All the elements were already in play in some way or another. I'll just quote from the last few lines of the booklet. He says, in particular, this is Coups, in particular it proposes that the co-articulation of capitalism, colonialism, and subject-centered philosophies does not express a necessarily epochal rupture, engendering modernity, but as an event, doubtless overdetermined, yet indeterminate, open to chance and probabilities. The space of this co-articulation is the ideological and epistemological space in which modernity and the modern forms of subjectivity are enacted. I call Occidentalism the discursive network which maps that space. That's typically a Coups sentence. Well, it's actually 3 sentences. Formulation. I mean, in a way, that couple of sentences condenses, articulates multiple critical registers. What is singularly striking about his work, for me, is his attempt to counter the violence and injustice of the world through an ethico-political register which demands new forms of subjectivity and being. In Occidentalism, he conceives the ethical, reworking the ideas of Levinas, Derrida, and Ricoeur as a responsibility and gift in terms of a temporality open to the radical alterity of the other to come. For him, time for him must not be a property belonging to anyone, but an opening to the future, quoting Coos. A promise arising from the recognition of injustice and the commonality of suffering. Recognition which is inseparable from the recognition that we exist as beings in time, conscious of temporality and of the inevitability of finitude. Coos' work continues to demand of us to think with him, together. Rereading Occidentalism now, I'm really struck how the book, while embedded in the theoretic debates of the time, also speaks to our moment, enacting a critique as hope in a time of despair. It speaks to us now against the anti-intellectualism of the university. It presents us with tools to think our post-colonial present. In the recent surge of interest in the decolonial and given the state of the world, we do no better than to think with Coos, to carry on the conversation. His time is always to come. When my father died very suddenly in 1996, Coos gave me a book of poems by Seamus Heaney. I would like to offer my gift to him by reading a very short poem called Quitting Time by Seamus Heaney. The hose down chamfered concrete pleases him. He'll wait a while before he kills the light. On the cleaned up yard it pales and farrowing crate, and the cast iron pump immobile as a herm, upstanding elsewhere in another time. More and more this last look at the wet shine of the place is what means most to him, and to repeat the phrase, my head is light, because it often is as he reaches back and switches off, a home-based man at home, in the end with little, except this same night after nightness, ready up the work, the song of a tubular street steel gate in the dark as he pulls it to and starts his uphill trek. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ash. Thank you. And now go on. Okay. We'll talk about our post-colonial challenge. You okay?
Yes, I'm fine. Slightly too athletic getting down. Excuse me. And also thank you for inviting me up. I was saying I felt very fraudulent because I understand it's because I'm at UEL and you think we must have overlapped. Well, we didn't overlap. So I was thinking actually, in some ways, I'm here for all the unknown readers, and I wonder if that's actually what we're all kind of hoping for. Obviously, writing at home, that someone will come as the unknown readers will come to remember us as well. So I don't have personal stories, but I am one of the many, many unknown readers who appreciated whose friends were. I just have my little cards to help me do it. I should take my glasses off. It's not come to that age. Post-colonial challenge, it published in 2006. So there's quite a lot of stuff going on in this country around quite fractious debates about the post-colonial, people who lived through that time. And I think one of the things that attracts me to his way of working around those debates, and did at the time as well, was opening that set of debates beyond the purely literary and or culturalist. I think in this country, post-colonialism became quite quickly very much about stories. My own training was in that kind of field, but the debates around post-colonial are always about trying to push it beyond just the representation. The representation is only one structuration. And Coos's work is very much about saying, well, yes, learn how to read stories, but only so that you can plot them against these other structures. And there's also something about this book which, again, rereading it, you kind of feel the horror of what the last couple of decades has been like, because he's already speaking very much then about this enormity of what a still then emerging neoliberal power is like, just how intrusive and intensive and multi-directional it is, and how we might try and encounter that through post-colonial critique. And I think what's interesting is that even though he's kind of documenting, there's loads of documentation of all these truly horrible things happening in the world, that things have happened and that are happening in that early moment of the 21st century, but he's always returning to saying, well, maybe that's not the only thing. Something else could happen. There's this whole kind of quite miserable bit in the middle that says all the things about, oh, neoliberalism means this about trade, it means this for the poor, and then it has all these pages, which I just think, oh. And then it has this little bit at the end, thought, but of course, protest against globalisation may be a portent to another possibility or something like that. So it's like, okay, I know there's horror, but never think there's only horror. And I think that's also really important. It's polite, he doesn't say it as a corrective, but I read it as a slight corrective to some of the ways that post-colonial thought was taught and read in this country. And actually I wonder if it's even a slight corrective to the ways in which decolonial critique is being institutionalised. It's not about saying there's been one thing happen and we'll just fix it like that. It's that there's this churn of horror, but we are trying to be human amongst it and have these little moments of opportunity. And part of that is also in his telling about not relinquishing modernity to the West, which I think is, I just put my glass on because I can't see you, even though I can't see you. I can't see you, but I can't see what I've done. Because I think much of the debate that's going on, and very much led by much younger people, acts as if the West is this kind of monolithic force. And of course, Western power is this huge history of violence, but it's never the only thing going on. And so part of the post-colonial challenge is saying, well, modernity has always had those other modernities. And he has this lovely stuff about, you know, Japanese histories and Indian histories and about the attempts to use small registers of Western modernity to say, well, that's rubbish, your modernity. It doesn't even register the human. How could we think again about modernity? And I think, well, that's worth us kind of remembering, especially when this turf war about who owns what, everyone repair everything, everyone say sorry, you can't say sorry, and I think, well, maybe history is not quite like that. And I think that's absolutely rooted in the really very complex analysis he gives in this book. He's all the time saying that everything is a multiple set of forces together, including us. But he has some lovely writing about creolisation, and actually lots of people are talking about hybridity and creolisation and all those things. But he's kind of saying, that's everyone. It's not like, oh, we get to be funky and Creole, you get to be trashy and white. It's kind of saying all cultures. He had a word that I couldn't find again, which I've never heard before, which is, I think is a word for meaning that everything's recombined. It's like recombinant or something, which I'll actually look up in my dictionary. But I think, well, that's not only combined, but recombined. It's like I'm being a reflect. But we're all finding our lobsters. But the lobster being two, but all finding our little bits together. Also for me, in that first decade of the 21st century, which seems like, of all the horrible decades of my lifetime, one of the most horrible, it's quite important for me that although he's engaging with these quite deeply theoretical debates, he's saying you can know about the world, which I also think has been not always absolutely present in some academic context of talking about the post-colonial. There's a whole acknowledgement of both neoliberalism when lots of people looking at culture are not quite looking at it yet, and more importantly, stuff about militarism. I was obsessed by the war on terror for all kinds of reasons. I feel like I've only recently stopped getting up in the night and had kind of, did some terrible things. I forgot her name, some kind of middle-of-the-road Labourish MP. I went to some consultation about women's rights, and everyone was talking about better street lighting, but it was one of the days when another horrible rendition story had broken in the press. I just started screaming my head, like, don't talk about women's rights, because how can you be rendering people? Even though Cruz Fenn's work is much more polite than that, it's kind of saying, don't talk about this stuff without talking about the war on terror. Don't talk about the new militarisation of the world. Don't talk about your Creole identity. You're not also saying that neoliberalism is being augmented and extended and entrenched through absolute violence. And so these things are in play, as if like, there's the hard politics of dead bodies, and then there's the kind of cultural politics of expressing yourself. And part of that is also the ways in which he tries to resurrect political economy, which again I think is a bit before his time. Now everyone's talking about political economy again. Or people think, oh yes, the songs of my youth have come back. But there's a long period in between when no one knows. You could say political economy loudly in any academic department in the country, and people say, what are you talking about? You know, political economy has come back. And the book ends with, like, what would be a post-colonial political economy? Right. Well, I've already said the stuff about, stuff about militarism is also about saying that we need to understand how the beast reconfigures itself, which I think is really core to the book. So part of the book is saying, yes, look back at violent history and how it makes this present, and it makes us in the present. And he doesn't mean like it makes us as victims, but he's saying that they're all kind of assembled by these different layers of things that enable what we can say, what we can experience, machinery, the kind of tools of how we see and be in the world. Has a lovely little story about microscopes. He says, well, a microscope is like kind of it's a conglomeration of all of this kind of history of technology and of material culture and of wealth, but it also changes how the human subject is able to be in the world. The microscope doesn't see, so something about, well, we can't see this till the microscope, and says, well, microscopes don't see anything. But what it says microscopes, humans, what it means for humans to see of a certain kind, is a whole different thing. And he's saying that all that sedimented set of layers of things, that's in change. And that he has a real sense of urgency about how that changing beast needs to be felt and resisted. And that can only happen through this insistent connection between culture, politics, and economics, even in our own experience, that we're always that mixture of meaning machines, whoever else we think we are. Now the last thing I was going to say, and one of the other things that's lovely about this book, which really made me nostalgic and I've forgotten, is that the last chapter isn't a conclusion, it's a glossary. And it's got all these tiny essays about these big theory words. You think, if only people would do that more often. And also, just what a lovely thing to do. And also, it's so democratising, isn't it? How often do you, especially if you move across fields, as people already said, because his work moves very lucidly and confidently across fields, but not everyone can do that. So if you can't say at the end, oh, actually, I know I've been using these words all the time, but in case you've never read those 15 books that I read about that one phrase, here's half a page. But yes, everyone should learn that lesson, if not any other. But not in alphabetical order. But the last thing that I was, so I'm a bit rambling all over the place, but the thing I was going to say is that not all post-colonial work has been that optimistic in reality, and not always as politically engaged as perhaps it pretends to be. It sounds very bad-tempered, but I do. And I think that's the fault of the university, actually. I don't think that's the fault of individuals. I think universities make good ideas crappily kind of institutionalised so they can't do anything. But I think that's my view. Goldsmiths doesn't like that, I should say. But one of the things that he really kind of pushes all the time in his account of the post-colonial is the post-colonial not as a description of what's passed, but as a kind of promise of what could come. And in all his lovely little essays, you can't see that all the essays are like a page or 3 pages, but the one about the post-colonial, which the whole book is about, is literally 4 lines, and it says, the post-colonial can be understood as a virtual space, that is, a space of possibility and emergence. It's thus also potential becoming. It opens towards a future that will not repeat existing forms of sociality and oppressive power relations. It's kind of saying, I think, why bother if it isn't that? Because what are we in the game for? And for all of the unknown readers, that's why they're reading, in the hope that will come.
Thank you so much, Gorky. Now we're going to Theory, Culture and Society, Mike and Ryan.
It's interesting hearing about the glossary. Because, at one point, Coos made a glossary on the TCS website, and I just forgotten about that. Of course, glossary, encyclopedia, editing. I mean, this is what I really want to talk about. And Ryan too, about the new encyclopedia project. Editing, I worked over 20 years editing with coups, and of course, you know, editing, putting things together, assembling, is part of writing as well. But the editing side of producing a journal is a very interesting thing because it involved all sorts of excitement about the serendipity of what was coming in the door. It also involved lots of problems with dealing with awkward authors who didn't understand why you wouldn't publish their papers. It involved the rounds of board meetings and Skypes with lots of very interesting and stimulating discussions and lots of problems too. So really working with coups in the journal was a day-to-day thing. We were on the Skype, we were phoning, we were doing things, we were emailing all the time. What was the outcome? Well, another issue comes out, another special issue maybe. Do you want to operate the slides? So these are some of the special issues, probably more recently, that coups discussed and worked on these. And you can see a massive range of topics in TCS we were looking at. And coups, as we're going to say, has a very encyclopedic knowledge and attitude, and he really liked working on this big range. So I found the coups very easy to work with, very easy to tune to, and we often thought the same about the papers we looked at. But he actually wrote quite a lot for the journal. His scholarly output was impressive. He wrote 3 books for the TCS book series, 2 have been addressed already. But he wrote 20 pieces for the journal, including interviews and translations. Topics range from culture theory, post-colonialism, neoliberalism, race, multiculturalism, biopolitics. One of his articles, Beyond Enlightenment, published in 1997, had the interesting subtitle, After the Subject of Foucault, Who Comes? And just before he died, as we heard, he returned to this theme. He also wrote a number of short pieces for the new encyclopedia project, pieces on the collection, knowledge, assemblage, translation, modernity, and rubbish. The NEP was a very crazy, impossibly ambitious project, both constructive and deconstructive at the same time. The editorial challenges were immense, but exhilarating as well. It was a very intellectually exciting time working with coups on this, and we travelled together to Japan, to Korea, China, Singapore and South Africa, discussing and collecting material for the project and working on a number of workshops and colloquia. The project wouldn't have taken off without the half a dozen long working sessions we had in Singapore and Nottingham with Ryan Bishop and John Phillips, who became co-editors. We still had the luxury of time in academic life at that time. So that the monster eventually emerged in 2006, 616 pages. It was called a double issue. It was some double issue. So coups was a tremendously wonderful friend and colleague, and Ryan's going to say a little bit now about the actual working together with you.
I fear that I fear that much of what I'm going to say is going to fall into the Department of Redundancy department, which is a minor joke. But first of all, I wanted to say that coups share the quality that is possessed by all the best academicians I've ever met or worked with. And that includes Derrida, that includes a whole bunch of people. And it's one that's come up several times, and that's generosity. Kouz's overall impression on me, and others I suspect, is generosity. A generosity of mind, of time, of spirit, of attention, of empathy, of laughter, but mostly a generosity of thinking what thinking is and what the ethics of thinking are and could be. That idea that was raised just a moment ago about the way things are and the kind of tyranny of the copula verb was always something that met in Kouz's mind with the possibilities of logos. This is the way things are, but it could be otherwise. And of course that he was diagnosed as terminal years ago, and then he spent those years working on a book intended to provide a map for making the world better. Essentially, and doing this a way to progress all of humanity in a collective endeavor in a moment of waning optimism sums up Kouz top to bottom. What else would a person so defined by and defining of generosity do? To him, it was as natural as breathing the breath he knew he was far too short of. So the NEP, Mike's already talked about the New Encyclopedia Project. It was a chaotic, Borgesian endeavor of gloriously infinite futility, which is why we did it. It was a grand folly, but also a grand playground of ideas, marginalia, palimpsest, stories, and supplements. As Mike said, the thing was years in the making. We traveled all over. We met, the four of us, Mike, Kouz, John Phillips, and I. We met several times for several days, working from morning before breakfast all the way through till night, and sharing discussions, debates, sessions hashing out taxonomies, entries, supplements, contributors, contributions, failed lines of inquiry, flights of fancy, and lots of food, as Julian mentioned, and lots of, well, every now and then, lots of wine. These gatherings constitute one of the highlights.
When Kouz died, I remember thinking, looking at After Capital and thinking about, and I've been thinking a while, because Val was going to have a symposium here, and we were going to talk about the book, and Kouz was going to join by video link. One of the phrases kept going through my mind was, "Let us now praise famous men," the famous James Ajee book. And then I remembered a quote, or I couldn't find a quote, which I read many years ago, and eventually I found this quote. Of course, Kouz was a big follower of Foucault and a fan of Foucault's history or life of infamous men. But the quote I have is from somebody Kouz might not have been as inclined to read. It's Max Horkheimer in The Eclipse of Reason, but the quote isn't from Horkheimer. It's from Edgar Allan Poe. And it's Edgar Allan Poe on greatness. The quote is, "That individuals have soared above the plane of their race is scarcely to be questioned. But in looking back through history for traces of their existence, we should pass over all the biographies of the good and the great, while we search carefully the slight records of wretches who died in prison, in Bedlam, or upon the gallows." Thank you.
Thank you very much, both Brian and Mike. And now, I think, through the miracle of modern technology, we're going to have Tiziana Terranova on her phone. from Naples.
Hello?
Yeah, you're broadcasting into the room now. Well, broadcasting or microphoning into the room.
Okay, I can see you. You cannot see me, but I can see you. You're live on my screen. So, yes, I feel very saddened by the loss of Kouz. He became a very important presence, also intellectually. in my life. I was very moved by what I've seen on the live stream, seeing Valerie and Lisa and Ash, Jude and Mike, Ryan. So, yeah, it feels as if all this network of friendship and collaboration that we share, you could calculate a kind of degree of entanglement of our community of thinkers and intellectuals that we constitute, and he cares very much about that, and he cares very much about this notion of being entangled and kind of co-constituted. So I remember sometimes you get this photographic image of the first time that you met somebody, and that was meeting Guzman in 1996 at UEN, where I just started working, and he was kind of, he was occupying the office next to mine. He was a very gentle man who had done all this impressive work on Foucault with Valerie Walkerdine, who I knew very well, because I was, she was directing the PhD program while I was at Goldsmiths. So I knew that he was studying the kind of theory that I wanted to study. I didn't expect that I would come to work with him so closely at Theory, Culture and Society 10 years later. So I was very moved by just listening to Mike and Brian talking about life at the journal, which I was very lucky to share very intensely for quite a few years. And really learned a lot. And for me, Kuz was a fundamental part of the life of the journal. I mean, Mike and Brian already talked about it. He was extremely committed to the journal. He worked with joy and extremely hard for it until the end. I remember seeing him on Skype, participating to meetings when he couldn't move until last year. So that the Kuz I met and I got to know was the editor and curator who managed to be both strict and generous, because he had a very sharp eye for the articles, the value of the articles, and the relevance, especially for what was important in the particular moment. So I was responsible for co-editing with Kuz the special issue of Michel Foucault. It was a very labor-intensive affair where he led the way with graciousness and perseverance. I was kind of inexperienced in the work of editing, and especially working for such a high-profile journal. He was already an established Foucaultian scholar, and he knew the field very well, especially in its post-colonial inflection. He taught me a lot about how you do the kind of editorial work, the refereeing, the going through the essay, the kind of getting together the sense of the issue. And it was an important special issue, I think. He was one of the first to come out dedicated to Foucault after the new publications and translations of his later courses, especially security, territory, population, and the personal biopolitics. He had read them in French before they were translated. I had read them in Italian, where they appeared more or less around the same time. I was captured by them. I just couldn't, get my head out of them. It was like, they were causing me to see things differently. And Kuz exercised a kind of tutorship as well on my kind of renewed interest or absorption in Foucault's work on neoliberalism, which is where, kind of the whole, as you know very well now, 10 years later, a lot of the scholarship is. The special issue on Foucault from 2009 was a great issue with important names in the field, from Paul Rabinow to Judith Ravel, to Louise McNay and Stephen Collier, from Maurizio Lazzarato to Brian Massumi and David Macy. I contributed with an article on neoliberal political economy, which is still basically driving a lot of my research. But especially, I need to mention Kuz's contribution on neoliberal political economy, biopolitics and colonialism, and transcolonial genealogy inequality. I think, this work that was published 10 years ago was still at the forefront of researching this field, this kind of importance of kind of taking colonialism out of the kind of footnotes of the kind of the history of biopolitics to something that just happened at the periphery and putting it to the center. It was already there before, but I think that after his engagement with these new courses, it got even stronger, and I think a lot of it is also in After Capital. I would like to just remember from this last article what he said about where the different history of the present. Transcending the situation that he describes requires a radically different trans-colonial and trans-individual understanding of the essentially collaborative and co-implicate character of the production of all life. The implications mean the rejections of ontologies that support not only neoliberalism but other forms of dissociation and pauperization, often aligned to the hierarchization of difference, opening a way for a different history of the present and for imagining new economies and socialities. So this is something that feels very much of today. 10 years later, we're still talking about new ontologies, new cosmotechnics. We are talking about the kind of new economies and sociality, and this still remains at the forefront of what needs to be done. So in a way, I would like to think that even in his book After Capital and in the kind of new work on the common, the new kind of special section of the journal that will be initiated together with Jeremy Gilbert, we're going to bring some of this visionary outlook for the aftermath of capital, for what comes after capital, into this next few years. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tiziana.
Brilliant, brilliant.
Diane, would you like to come and talk about the next?
We've heard a lot about what a brilliant collaborator Coos was, but his greatest collaboration was with Francesca, and I'm going to talk about the book that they wrote together. Inequality, Poverty, Education combines passion, poetry and elegance in equal measure. It's a compelling yet gently persuasive analysis of the pathologization of poverty that's impressive in its historical depth and its conceptual breadth. The book shows us a complex but intricate genealogy of class exclusions that thread their way from the 19th century to the present. And in the process, the two authors entwine ideas from economics, politics, sociology, philosophy and psychology. We can see through the powerful arguments that Francesca and Cos present that there's never been the political will to solve the problem of poverty, but rather a range of measures designed to blame and subjugate the poor. Their analysis exposes how empty the rhetoric of social justice and inclusion in English education is, as a plethora of vindictive practices that target the poor, and especially the poor with special educational needs and disabilities, sweep through schools. Against the punitive tide of repressive measures against the poor, Francesca and Coos provide examples of the progressive movements introduced at different times in England, Europe and North America that have been committed to genuine inclusion of poor children. These include the Ragged School movements in England, the Maître Penal Colony in France, and the Children's Friends Society in Canada. All these progressive movements recognise the class basis of poverty and inequality, but all struggle to survive in a hostile environment in which the prevailing view has always been that poverty is a consequence of individual deficits rather than a lack of collective will, particularly among our elites. The book's focus is poverty, but specifically poverty in relation to education and social class, recognising that poverty and class are inextricably enmeshed. Just as in the 19th century, a majority of the working classes are now growing up in poverty, with growing numbers of the poor in work rather than unemployed. Inequality, poverty, education exposes this legacy
of 19th and early 20th century penal institutions, workhouses and poor homes in the present, not just in detention centres and inclusion units, but within mainstream schooling itself. Social class inequalities in education are rife, and although the ways in which they're played out in classrooms has changed dramatically since the 19th century that Francesca and Coase was writing so eloquently about, they still have enormous power to damage children's sense of themselves as learners. What has remained the same is that too little of the learning in classrooms focuses on teaching children to be collaborative and cooperative and to care for and respect each other across differences. And this is primarily a consequence of policies imposed from outside the classroom, resulting in an overriding preoccupation, particularly in working class schools, in raising literacy and numeracy levels. A second linked policy is a preoccupation with testing, assessment and ranking, which encourages individualised, competitive learning dispositions and increasingly a sense of shame and failure in those positioned at the bottom of assessment hierarchies. And this obsession with the basics and testing marginalises the broader curriculum and more holistic, child-centred approaches to learning, which the book shows us are really important for children to thrive. They also instrumentalise children as only valuable for what they achieve, undermining their sense of having any intrinsic value. But as well as presenting convincing historical and sociological insights into the way things are and the way they've always been in education, a further compelling strength of the book is the erudite ways in which it combines sociological with psychological understandings. We are told, and this is a quote, a return to a behaviourist psychology model, such as in cognitive behaviour therapy, which reflects the demand for cost-effective solutions and is more in keeping with a regime obsessed with evidence-based policy and practice and short-term budgetary objectives, has become prevalent. Cheap, largely ineffectual and rudimentary solutions have replaced any genuine attempt at a caring, therapeutic response to children and young people's growing levels of distress and anxiety. At a time of exponential growth in school exclusions and what is euphemistically called off-rolling, Francesca and Coase's analysis is both prescient and timely, revealing the cruelties inflicted on the poor by political and educational systems that continue to view them as waste and detritus, lacking in worth and intrinsic value. Inequality, poverty, education epitomises engaged scholarship, demonstrating political commitment to progressive change alongside intellectual acuity. We can see the dispositions of organic intellectualism in Francesca and Coase's words. In their erudite and elegant text, there is also an impassioned urgency and a fervent desire for a better, more equal world that treats all fairly. So what can we do? Well, for a start, we can take on board the powerful messages that Francesca and Coase's book conveys. As they write, there's a political economy of exclusion that is fueled by the current neoliberal reconstitution of all areas of society, not just education. If we are to address persistent educational inequalities of social class, increasingly the school is not the place to look, and it's also the wrong place to reform. Instead, as they point out, we need to focus on a much wider spectrum of policies and practices, including the economics of the family, in which upper and middle class families are able to use their economic and cultural advantages to ensure that their children are always able to do better than less advantaged children. And I would argue that the origins of racism and sexism likewise lie outside the school in families and wider society. We need a much fairer society economically, but also culturally, so that the United Kingdom becomes a society that views learning dispositions of confidence, entitlement, cooperation, curiosity, creativity, and reflexivity as the right of all children. And here schools have an important role to play to ensure that all these rights are realised. But as the book admirably demonstrates, we still have a very, very long way to go. The book is a brilliant historical genealogy, but it's also a very powerful wake-up call. And the UN Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty's very recent report shows just how timely, important and necessary inequality, poverty, education is. It may be an historical genealogy, but it's also a key book for our extremely unequal contemporary times. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diane. Shella is going to talk about after capital.
Okay, thank you, Valerie and Lisa, for organising this. I've written something, but I realised listening to all these wonderful presentations, I'm actually repeating a lot of what's been said, but that's not a problem. I think it's only testament to the consistency of Koos's thought, as we've already heard. We've heard about Koos as a writer, an intellectual, an editor, a collaborator, a friend. My own experience of Koos is as a teacher, not actually in the classroom giving lectures, but on the other end of Skype or email from his home in Devon, supervising quite a few MA students together, but also numerous PhD students. And it's always struck me as a kind of privilege that I wasn't paid to be a lecturer and yet have spent 5 years learning from Koos. So I think for all of us, it takes some getting used to the fact that we can't just sort of write to him and ask him a question or have those amazing Skype conversations with him. So I'll begin. So, the world is gone, I must carry you. Such is the enigmatic line by the poet Paul Celan. In the reading of Jacques Derrida, to whose work Koos often returned across his writings, including in After Capital, on the occasion of the other's death, each time, it is the end of the world. The world, not a world, has gone. The death of the other, to quote Derrida, is not only one end among others, the end of someone or something in the world. It marks each time defying arithmetic, the absolute end of the unique world, the end of the totality of what is or what can present itself as the origin of the world for such and such a unique living being, human or not, end quote. And hence the impossible work of carrying the other inside oneself, so Freudian introjection, interiorization of memory or idealization, and the necessity of a certain failure of mourning, i.e. of melancholy, in order to maintain the other's alterity, their singularity. So while the work of mourning as an ethical and a political project is something that Koos himself noted the importance of, for instance in his book on Occidentalism, in the context of his last book, After Capital, the end of the world takes on a different, albeit not unrelated, dimension. In the context of our contemporary climate emergency, many have noted that everything hinges upon the seemingly small linguistic slippage between the world and a world. In speaking of the end of the world, of which world and of whose world are we speaking? And who is the we that proclaims this? So for many, the current ecological emergency and the experience of living in ruins, in fact, began long ago, and the event of colonialism from 1492 onwards already marked the end of the world, of innumerable, each time singular life worlds. As we read in an open letter to the Extinction Rebellion that was published by the Wretched of the Earth Bloc, an associated grassroots collectives for indigenous, black, brown and diaspora groups demanding climate justice, quote, "For many of us, the house has been on fire for a long time. Whenever the tide of ecological violence rises, our communities, especially in the global south, are always first hit," end quote. And herein lies the urgency of After Capital, which I cannot help but think of each time I read such statements, and which silently carries the subtitle of Cous's 2006 book, The Postcolonial Challenge Towards Alternative Worlds. So Couse had already written here of postcolonial critique as being, quote, about the redrawing the diagrams of possible worlds, unquote. So Cous's analysis forms a powerful counter to those who would proclaim that we must rebel for life in the face of climate change, climate crisis, but that this crisis is beyond politics. Across the chapters, he spells out the manner in which our current predicaments are the result of neoliberal capitalism and a global system of extraction, dispossession, indebtedness, and oppression. So for most of us in the room, this comes as no surprise. But few of us could match the breadth, the rigor, and clarity of his diagnosis and his synthesis, an invaluable tool for teaching, that is the product of a lifetime's work. So the book repeatedly refers back to earlier writings, and part and parcel of Cous's own incessant rebellion. So regarding this rebellion, the book is infused with the revolutionary spirit and the dream of an emancipatory politics and a cosmopolitical future that, as Couse related just a couple of months ago, he tried to keep in mind whenever writing anything. So moreover, what After Capital stresses repeatedly is the constitutive role of colonialism in the history of capitalism up to the present, emphasizing the connection between colonialism and uneven distribution. Couse foregrounds the legacies of colonialism, which he did not diagnose as having been made invisible in many accounts of connected crises. So this allows for a wider vista in his patient relocating of the genealogy of power from classical sovereignty to governmentality and biopolitics. So in Cous's words, in order for there to be radical change in the way we inhabit the world, what is at stake is to find new foundations, quote, ones which dethrone the narratives that throughout history have authorized systems of exploitation and forms of violence, or that have failed to provide clear enough principles for opposing systemic inequalities and the mindless plunder of the earth, end quote. In other words, to put it very telegraphically, the book consists of two key moves. Firstly, carrying out what Couse names a transcolonial genealogy, which we've heard about. So this gesture in a Foucauldian vein is one of counter-history or counter-narrative, a critical genealogy of the present that disrupts the conventional narrative of progress and is in alliance with the politics of resistance in history from below. So the second move would be to seek alternative worlds, present and future. So this is most legible in the last two chapters, towards a world in common and new foundations for post-capitalist worlds. So this involves, amongst other things, quote, an ontology grounded in the idea of being as being with and being alongside, extended to all life. An ethics of co-responsibility for the other consistent with such an ontology. An epistemology that departs from assumptions of mastery over others and over nature, and that rejects anthropocentrism, self-centeredness, and scientisms such as geneticism and biologism, end quote. So imagining post-capitalist worlds would entail moving beyond attempts to simply fix or improve capitalism, and instead involves, quote, the rejection of any understanding of the worlding of a world that neglects its essentially co-implicate character, end quote, as well as a radical decentering of the subject, one that works through but also moves beyond critical theory, structuralism and post-structuralism, supplementing these with research from across a diversity of sciences that emphasizes relationality, co-emergence, co-constitution, complexity, cooperation, In other words, the co-implication of all beings in a world in common. But practically speaking, what would such a world look like? So Cruz gives us a few swift indicative pointers, all coupled with a healthy dose of caution. So for instance, the establishment of property regimes that prioritize commons and common pool resources, democratic decision-making processes that might take the form of radical democracy, federalism even, and decentralized networks, the establishment of alternative technologies away from fossil fuels, and through open access data, and vitally, quote, the liberation of knowledges that have been captured by the appropriative machine to constitute cognitive commons, end quote. So to end, the world is gone, I must carry you. Or rather, worlds are gone in the plural, and countless eyes must carry countless views. On the very last page of the book, after capital, is an endnote that reads as follows. I had originally envisaged discussing the practical dimension of post-capitalist transformation in an eventual part 2 of After Capital. For health reasons, I cannot do this now. I cannot now do this, end quote. Unreadable for many of us in this room this evening, this brief note is, and indeed should be, incalculable for anyone. It's a powerful injunction, premised upon a seemingly limitless generosity of spirit and mind. A gift that demands that, with After Capital to help us, we continue to reinvent means through which to create and to be carried by alternative worlds.
Thank you so much. Now I think we're going to try and turn to Braca if we've got her on Skype. Well, while you're doing that, I think we are beginning, I feel incredibly moved by all the important and beautiful tributes and the understanding of the huge range of the man and what he's left for us. So when we get Braca, she'll...
I see you.
There she is, okay.
Do you want to turn on your camera or do you just want to use audio?
I don't know if it works. I see you.
Okay, and so, 1 second. There you go. We do, yep. Just 1 second. See you, yeah.
We see half of you, Braca.
See half of me. What should I do with that?
Oh,
There we go.
Yeah, very
Yes, yes, we see all of you now.
Okay, and you should be able to see everybody too.
Which half, please?
Which half we see? Yep. We see.
Because
No,
Exactly.
we're fine now, Braca, we see all of you. We're just getting the technology. Hang on a moment, we're just getting the technology right.
So, can you just say something? Okay, we'll go this way.
I think she's moving.
Hang on, Braca.
I feel very honored and very touched. I don't know if you hear me.
Yeah.
Should I turn off the camera? So
No, I think we're fine now, Braca, we're fine.
Yeah, I think you can go ahead now.
Well, we have a difficult connection, and therefore I will be quick.
Okay.
I think that a lot was said, and a lot that I wanted to discuss was also already said, and everybody in that room felt the wings of generosity of Kuz. Kuz and Mike Featherstone that were interested in my work was also already
Oh. You should probably turn off your live feed.
Turn off, yeah. You've got the live feed on Braca.
Yeah, you've got
Turn it
the-
off.
I took the image so that we have a better chance.
No,
It's not the image.
it's the live stream on your web browser, so if you close the browser window with the live stream, then it'll be okay. Yeah. And you can turn your camera back on if you wish.
Okay. All right. I'm going to be quite brief. As I said, I'm very honored to be invited by you and very touched because the way Koos and Mike Featherstone embraced my work in the early 2000s was extremely meaningful for me. And I read the notes he wrote for the last coming book, and I take it as an invitation to enter this domain, which is so much Koos himself, the domain of being with and dialoguing with and contributing to, because this book put very major important ideas about the affective field and other ideas, and is consistent in insisting that we cannot ignore the individual psychology no matter what. So we cannot go around it. That even if we wish to go around it, we are not going to succeed. And therefore, even if psychology had not been successful in explaining to us and including to us all the dimension of subjectivity we need to know about, we cannot renounce of it. I think that his project is one of humanizing the human subject. And that the question of how to humanize the human subject is right now embedded with few questions that arise in his book, and which put us perhaps in a position to be able to do with all of you, some kind of a collaborative work or responses to the notes for the future book that he was preparing, in which he puts few questions. And one of the ways to talk about it for me is through the difference. He's referring to autopoiesis, but in terms of my conversation with him, I know that he was interested to understand more about the difference between what autopoiesis brings us and the ontogenesis brings us, and then copoiesis, which is a different matter. The same goes with the question of symbiosis, how to make the difference between symbiosis and symbiotic behavior, which immediately calls for some kind of split, and matrixial copoiesis, which already recognizes differences on the most basic level of individuation. So I suppose in his book there is a call to make the difference between the trans-individual and trans-subjective, pre-individual and pre-subjective, and what would be the meaning of the new psychoanalytical discoveries and even biological discoveries in order to humanize now the human subject. For me personally, Koos was important because of his appeal to always ask in what way we can apply psychoanalytic terms and psychoanalytical universe into the social field. one of the things in his last book is he points to the failure of certain attempts in the 40s, the 50s, the 60s to check how, who are the people who would collaborate with fascism, the authoritarian person, and all this research. And he marks that perhaps the limitation of the possibility to approach this question is rooted in the limitation of the Freudian field itself. How much Freud could take the development of the field is how much could the research on that subject continue. And this is not a small subject, because when we would like, if we would like to form new subjectivities, we need to ask ourselves how, in what way, some of the metapsychological argument of Freud, the basic assumptions, were somehow wrong. One point about humanizing the human would be for me to go beyond the death drive as Freud defines it, and beyond the life drive as Freud defines it, because the life drive that Freud defines is leaning on the model of unicells and germ cells. Therefore, life drive in Freud applies for life, that life can continue and living instances can continue, but finally without the human, and without considering human suffering and human history and even human culture. So I think that Kuz left us with the inheritance of paying attention to this interdisciplinary way in which we can change the conception of the subject, and therefore of the subject of society, the interdisciplinary value of his mission that is to be continued, and also invite us to think how in the fields of affect that he suggests, how to localize points of resistance to the hypermedia and hyper-consummation of us as subjects. It is interesting that the question that porcelain and the world has gone, and I must carry you, has been mentioned. And I will continue in that line for a little moment to talk about, indeed, that care and carrying is knowledge. The way that Kuz was caring and carrying whoever he was meeting in all kind of levels, even on the small levels that we could meet. There was this question of how he carries you, how he cares and carries, and how we can carry now him. Because carrying is knowledge, and carriance, to care, to be cared, to carry, to be carried by, is a kind of a symbolic relief for a real of carrying and being carrying, but also for its sublimation. In the real, carriance absorbs the effects of that working on all kinds of affective strings and threads. While the one carries and the other is being carried, subconscious of carriance, subconscious that includes those co-poetic encounters and resonance elements, informs the unconscious. It is important for me at that point in time with the new book to underline the difference between autopoiesis
which he refers to, and copoiesis, which was printed in his encyclopedia, in the subject of when he printed the transsubjective matriciality and so on. So one little contribution to the field of that affective field that Kuz is suggesting. What is the problem with autopoiesis that is right now very on the agenda? The problem is that it relates to the self-maintaining chemistry, even at the cellular level, and revolves as a metaphor, finally, around a self for whom the non-I is an object for its interest, and also which might reject that which is not me and reject the other when it doesn't fit its ontogenetic interests. So autopoiesis on the one hand is a very, very important concept, but copoiesis would be the opening of that, in the sense that we cannot just live with the notions of autopoiesis and symbiosis, which would occur between anything and anything, anybody and anybody. While copoiesis, unlike autopoiesis and symbiosis, means an affective, humanizing alliance of differences. Humanizing alliance of differences, differentiation in jointness, differentiation in co-emergence. And therefore it calls for the sensoriality, the sensibility, and the affective arousal and emotional catharsis, and the human care. Human care is a part of Kuz's projects, the way I'm reading it. And one of the, what is very important for me as well in my history with Kuz is his attention to the question of difference, sexual difference, the feminine, the matrixial difference, this deep understanding that something is missing in the way we structured subject. This is a part of his ongoing mission, which I think we should continue, and we can continue. What is missing? Well, there is a form of subject that is probably kind of over, a kind of subject that is not anymore possible. But this structure of the subject did not include the feminine. It included the feminine on its own conditions. And therefore, rethinking the feminine would mean rethinking anew the subjective possibility. Because we cannot give up on the subject, because the subject is still and will always be the agent of responsibility and the agent of care. And when we say the subject is dead, and then we also would say responsibility is dead, and caring is dead, and carrying is impossible. So I think that when Kuz talks about the affective field, it pays attention not only to trans-individuality, which is community and collective, but to trans-subjectivity and transjectivity, which relies on a shareable real resonance, field of affect that is activated in the now. I can stop now. I can only say that from afar, Kuz, together with Mike, were very important when they reached for me in the 2004 2003, I think, when the project began, of this special number of theory, culture and society. And that I would like to continue to contribute to any project that you would like to invite me to, which will prolong the last book in the form of notes that he left. And I'd like to thank you again.
Thank you so much, Rafa. Thank you very, very much. How do we get back to the Thank you very much. And now Jeremy is going to come and talk the last presentation on the political implications of Koos's work. Thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks. I've got to read from the phone as well. I had no intention of printing anything, but computer style. Right, is this alright for volume? Okay. So yeah, I first met Koos also, same year as Ash, in 1993. I was an undergraduate at on the Cultural Studies programme at UEL. And before I met him, I used to go to his lectures, which was notable because Koos's very rigorous lectures in the sort of political applications of continental philosophy were a bit much for sort of second year undergraduate. So there would quite often be me and one other person in the room. that other person is now an MP in the Irish Parliament. I'm stuck here. So you can see the kind of influence he had. Even then, I remember those lectures actually. Those lectures already, the first one I would have heard would have been either 92 or 93, and it was on the subject of post-colonial governmentality. So I think that was quite significant. I wasn't really to realise until much later how significant it was that he was talking in those terms at that time, because this was the early 90s, and this was when Foucault's governmentality essays were on the point of becoming an extremely fashionable reference point in certain areas of social science, but in a way which entirely neutralised any kind of any political radicality to them. The governmentality school of reading Foucault was to become really the dominant way in which Foucault was disseminated for many years, really long before the translation and publication of the biopolitics lectures and the other college lectures from the late 90s. And Foucault and Koos was quite relatively unique, at that time, in really having, well, not unique, but he was distinctive in having a reading of Foucault and some of the other Parisian thinkers as being always kind of radical political thinkers. Which again, it's easy to say now, but that was really significant, and it was hugely significant for me. Because just for me personally, Koos was sort of reading my, Koos. I really got to know Koos because he was supervising my undergraduate dissertation. Which I don't know if I've ever said this publicly. I was told, I think I wasn't supposed to be told this, it was secret, but they gave me a really good mark for the dissertation, but the external examiner insisted that the mark be raised. And that was this guy called Mike Featherstone. Whom I've always written. This is why to this day I can't bring myself to turn down a TCS peer review request. There's plenty of them. So that was the dissertation that became, not my first book actually, the third or fourth book, depending how you count them, the most recent one. And so it was, But I mean, it was very important because at the time, the idea, reading a particular reading of Derrida was very important, but the idea that you could read Derrida as a kind of figure of the left at that particular moment, especially just before the publication of Spectres of Marx, which only came out while I was doing it actually, and I kind of struggled through bits of it in French. Before that was very, counterintuitive, because essentially, again, this is an important part, I think, of our sort of intellectual history. I would say what happened with the emergence of Anglophone post-structuralism in the 1980s is that a bunch of thinkers from Paris, most all based in not France, they were all in Paris, who were in various ways engaging with the kind of long political fallout of 1968, but would all clearly have seen themselves kind of unequivocally as figures of the left, were picked up and read mainly in literature departments in the English-speaking world, and they were basically read for any kind of intellectual resource which could be used to kind of defend Anglo-American liberalism from criticism from either Marxist critique or from the New Right, which they were kind of counterposed against. So this very powerful sort of reading formation emerged around those post-structuralist texts, which essentially did read them as resources for liberalism and not for anything more radical than liberalism. And Coues was very sort of isolated, very unusual in reading them differently. In reading it in a way which I think was much truer to their sort of Parisian politics, and he definitely transmitted that idea to me. And I think, and his sort of range of interests even at that time, which were both sort of with the grain of intellectual fashion and against it in very important ways, I think are really worth reflecting on it for the way that they kind of carried on. I came into, I sort of got to know Coues, and I wanted to do this dissertation because I'd been preoccupied with this notion of the problem of the distinction between the individual and society since I'd done an A-level in philosophy. I had to read John Stuart Mill, and I said, this guy's an idiot. He keeps going on about the individual, he keeps going on about society like it's separate from the individual. That's just silly. And then, but Coues' really sort of ability to kind of, his kind of recognition of what I was talking about and his ability to really sort of help me develop it came from a kind of particular place, which was quite unique at that moment. That particular moment, the idea of an anti-individualist politics was extremely marginal on kind of intellectual left in Britain. This was the moment of new times. It was the moment when, frankly, even Stuart, I think, frankly, made too many concessions to a kind of radical, to a kind of liberal individualism in the way he thought about identity and politics, which Coues never did. And Coues also never did that without ever retreating into a kind of reductive or reactive kind of conservatism or a sort of dogmatic reading of Marxism. He never abandoned the Marxist critique of capital, even while also again always rejecting any kind of dogmatism. He was always believed that it was possible to sort of carry forward the intellectual project of cultural studies, for example, without making any sort of compromise in one's commitment to the study of philosophy on its own terms, to the study of critical theory on its own terms, to engagement with psychoanalysis, to engagement with even ideas like ecology. And again, I would say that throughout his career and right up until and including the last book, there's really no one else about whom you can really say they were able to carry off that level of commitment to kind of interdisciplinarity, and a sort of interdisciplinarity isn't even quite the right term. I mean, he would really take completely seriously the commitment both to the sort of critical philosophical project of thinking through problems at their appropriate level of abstraction to their logical conclusions, and also the cultural studies project, the analysis of conjuncture, the analysis of the present, the analysis of historical reality. And there's really no one else, I think, who quite was able to do that in the same way. It remains a very important project. And again, within the culture of universities, within the sort of culture of academic institutions, I think, there very often is a sort of pressure to sort of go one way or another in that direction. It was this set of, it was very important for my generation. Again, I belong to, or for me, because I belong to that cohort, kind of like Lisa did, I belong to that cohort, for whom really actually, especially in the 90s, there was this quite odd phenomenon actually. There were lots of people who were getting jobs for cultural studies and media studies. There were growth areas, but mostly they were frustrated philosophers. Mostly they were frustrated people, people who read a bit of Derrida and they were doing their English degree and they really wanted to be Heidegger. They really wanted to do that. And there was this kind of antipathy. So you were sort of if you were into post-structuralist philosophy or French philosophy generally or phenomenology, you were supposed to have this real kind of, you actually have this kind of resentment towards, Stewart and Raymond Williams and like cultural studies, this boring historical political project. And it was Coos who absolutely at a very early age really communicated to me to the idea there was absolutely no need to take that position. You could be as interested in both of those things at the same time as you wanted to be, and you could be interested in those things in a fully synthetic way, and you could carry through that commitment, really ultimately to its own logical conclusion. And I think that radical that sort of interdisciplinarity without shortcuts, without taking the shortcut of dogmatism, without taking the shortcut of any kind of intellectual laziness, was absolutely central. It became absolutely central to the project of TCS. Like one reason it's been such a successful, such an important part of the sort of intellectual landscape that so many of us have inhabited, and why it amounts to a very important kind of political project in its own right. Throughout the kind of the next quarter of a century, Coos and I, and many other people, as we've all seen here today, continue to share, to share interests, to share commitments. It's really sort of striking that we both started reading Simondon at the same time. Like we haven't really even talked. I remember we hadn't really talked to each other for about 6-7 years, and we saw each other, exchanged an email and said, "What have you been reading?" "I've been reading Simondon," and because Simondon is the sort of great think of the trans individual, and I think that comes from a kind of continuous commitment to trying to find intellectual resources which really do fundamentally do undertake the absolutely necessary, politically necessary task of refuting bourgeois liberalism, which remains kind of persistent, sort of hegemonic, normative frame of reference of both mainstream politics and the kind of mainstream humanities and social sciences, without ever sort of collapsing into any kind of conservatism or dogmatism. Now, and of course, Coos also was always committed to a certain idea of education. He was always committed to the idea of pedagogy. He was always committed to the idea, to the desire to communicate. He was always animated by the desire to communicate ideas and to communicate ideas to broad audiences. I think he was. I know he was because he told me, and Francesca told me as well that he was occasionally frustrated by the fact that only 2 people would turn up to the lecture in 1973, and that he didn't have a sort of mass audience, he didn't have a popular audience, and he didn't have the kind of scale of readership which the quality of the work justified, really. I think works like Occidentalism and the Post-Colonial Challenge, and probably also Art Capital, didn't really have that. And I think it's important to think about why didn't they, and is that a permanent situation? I mean, towards the end of his life, actually, he started to write articles, for a more popular audience. He started to write a bit for Open Democracy, because we talked about the idea that would be a good thing for him to do, and I sort of helped him with that a little bit. But I think it's partly because the rigour and the exhaustive rigour of Coos's approach to things necessarily generated quite complex approaches, just generated quite complex text, quite long text, quite dense sort of text. And I think this in itself is something which has a real value in a kind of epoch of inattention, in an intellectual culture in which really, there's a sort of real, I can moan about this for hours, but there's been a real sort of, publishers have redefined in the past 10 years what counts as a book now. Things get called books, which are not books, they're pamphlets. Including, I'm very happy about it in some ways because it's allowed some friends of mine to be very successful and influential, but it does also allow lots of people to think they've read books when they've read pamphlets. And Coos didn't write pamphlets. Coos, even when he tried, he couldn't really write a pamphlet. He was always writing a book. He was always writing these very rigorous sort of essays and works. And I think that commitment to a certain level of complexity is politically necessary under certain circumstances. I think what After Capital is, as a book is partly a testament to is the fact that the scale of the interlocking crises which manifest themselves as the environmental catastrophe cannot be understood in non-complex terms. They can't be understood without that level of rigour and attention. And even though if some of the issues involved do have to be communicated in relatively simple terms to particular audiences and particular context, ultimately that complexity is inescapable, and it's something which has to be engaged with. And I think, I would also say that I think it also, I was thinking, I started to write, I started to write, oh well, After Capital is the key book for a movement yet to come. I was thinking, and I thought, am I really going to use the phrase yet to come again? Because the first time I used that was in my undergraduate dissertation. I've used it a lot of times, and I don't think I want to do it anymore. So I'm going to say, it's not just yet to come. I actually think this is a kind of concrete, the abstract to the concrete. This is a concrete prediction. I do think that work will be read much more widely than it currently is at some point. If you want to guess, I think in about 10 years. So it's about where I think we are in the kind of cycle of historical change and political revival. Because in some sense, those are books which, especially After Capital is a book which requires a kind of social movement, a political movement, at a higher level of kind of organisation and a higher level of capacity than we currently have for it to be widely readable, for it to be widely processable, for it to be influential. But I think that movement is not as absent as it was at that very nadir moment, which I agree with Garvey's sort of the early 2000s, which I think I've been preoccupied by this because I had to do an interview with a journalist a couple of days ago. He said, where are we at now? Where are we at in terms of in history? I said, well, it's not great. It's got a few years to go, but I think it's not as bad as it was like in 2000.
15 years.
Yeah, 15 years ago. So I think it will, and I think it is, it will be a book for that moment. It will be a book, for that movement. It will be a book for a movement, for a politics, which is animated by several key features which any ultimate address to the climate crisis and its implications will have to contain. It will be a politics and a movement which is informed by a full understanding of the historic relationship between colonialism and capitalism. So I think we're only beginning, we all know it historically, but it's only really sort of filtering into the broader political behaviour relatively slowly. And it will be animated by a radical conception of freedom, which is completely non-individualistic and completely independent of the kind of liberal sort of possessive tradition which still haunts most discussions of the idea of freedom and expressions of freedom in the West, and by an entirely non-conservative conception of mutuality. And again, one of the problems which haunts our age is the fact that we find it difficult to think about mutuality without thinking about it in conservative terms. So I'm thinking in terms of the nation, the family, the communitarian unit. And Coos was always thinking in terms of a conception of mutuality, not just human mutuality, but kind of ecological mutuality, in a way which is entirely non-conservative, entirely open to the possibility of a future animated by real freedom. I think that will be his legacy.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. I want to thank everybody who presented this evening. I think it was the most wonderful, moving tribute to a great man, a very great and generous man. I think that I hope that the next generation on, some of whom are here, can carry on that work. Thank you very, very much. We've got outside there's some alcohol which we can share, but there's also a memory book. So if you have particular memories to share about Coos, please do write in it, because then we're going to pass it on to Francesca and the family. So please do consider writing something in that book. thank you very, very much for coming together. I want to, as all, to give each other a clap.